Hello there, friends and sane persons. My name is Kyle, and it's Wednesday, and it's time for another Wednesday Whimsy. Wednesday Whimsy is, of course, a short show I do every Wednesday evening where I talk about. Oh dear, I apparently have this open in another room. Well, let me let's turn that off. Apologies. You love seeing behind the scenes here. Anyway, Wednesday Whimsy is a short show I do every Wednesday evening where I talk about a board game topic, a top 10 list, or some other board game related factor, and I tell you what I'm thinking about it, whatever happens to be on my mind that day. Today we have kind of a special episode. The last few weeks I've talked about a couple of games. I talked about Masters of the Universe Fields of Eternia last time, and I talked about Masters of the Universe Clash for Eternia a few weeks before that. I don't have the date, but it's about a month ago, I guess, probably. Anyway, so these are both games that feature the Masters of the Universe license. That is He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, the best cartoon and toy series of all time. Totally not biased about that, but really, as I mentioned on both of those other occasions, these are shows that I grew up with, and really have a lot of meaning to me. So when I heard both games were coming out, I was just beyond excited. I was just so thrilled. When I heard that one game would be exclusive to North America, I was like, oh, well, that's not great. When I heard one game would be exclusive to only a few countries in Europe, I was like, oh no, how can I survive if I don't have both? So I went out of my way to get both. I played both. This is not an episode where I'm going to tell you which one I like more. I mean, I've made that obvious. Clash for Eternia, the U.S. version, the CMON version, is one of the best games to come out in a long time. It's a 10 out of 10 for me. Fields of Eternia, the Archon Studio one, the European one, is basically a piece of trash that I can't throw away because it has lots of He-Man minis in it. 4 out of 10. So I obviously have my own bias about them, but what I thought might be fun, or at least instructive, or at least interesting for me, would be to talk about why I feel so strongly, because these are obviously fairly polar opposites um, on on games that you would think would be, that I initially was concerned would be exactly the same. So I have a couple of scoring characteristics here, but I'm just going to sort of talk freeform and tell you sort of what Clash does well and what Fields does poorly. Or there may be some areas where Fields does better. I might refer to them as the CMON and the Archon game, just because Clash for Eternia and Fields of Eternia sound almost the same. It's very confusing naming conventions. But let's just dive right in. So the first thing I have written down here is playtime. Fields of Eternia is the Archon game is probably about 2 hours. I'm just going to check really quickly what Board Game Geek says, but the games I've played have all been in the 2 hour range, and that's including solo. So it doesn't matter the number of players. The Board Game Geek says it's going to be 90 to 180 minutes, so that tracks. I tend to play a little faster than your average bear, but not super fast. On the other hand, Clash for Eternia, I have down 30 to 60 minutes. So, I mean, that's obviously much faster. It's going to play in about half the time. It looks like the Board Game Geek page says 60 minutes. So, generally agreeing with me, I might play a little bit faster. So, we have one game that's going to take at least twice as long as the other. Now, if that game is a deep strategy game like Twilight Struggle, you might like that. But where that game is kind of a schlocky dice chucking or card combat or run up and punch each other type of a game, I mean, 2 hours is a long time to be playing that game, especially if it's not very good. So I think, or Clash for Eternia, the CMON game, one thing it does really well is condensing its experience down into a really manageable time frame, which is going to work for just about any play group. I mean, anybody who's going to sit down for a game is usually willing to commit an hour, and it, in many cases, will be even less. On that, though, I'm going to talk briefly about setup. So Clash for Eternia, CMON game, has, its setup is relatively straightforward, but you do have to go through and pull out a bunch of terrain tiles. And you have to go through huge stacks of cards. I've got an insert coming for it. Hopefully that'll save this. But you've got to sort of pull out all the right characters and get sort of the two different sides, their different characters, the controller player and the player player. I will say that Fields of Eternia, the Archon game, is a little bit faster in setup. You always use the same board. You just sort of select the characters. They don't really have their own decks. They have sort of two identical decks that you're constructing over the course of the game. But then you set up a whole bunch of different side decks for the different shops and markets. But I will say setup definitely. I lean on Fields. That's one thing that it does better. Now we're going to talk about complexity. So let me start by saying that neither game is going to blow your minds in terms of complexity. But the rules and just sort of the way the rules interact with the experience, I'm going to give to the CMON game, to Clash for Eternia. The rules on this game, I could get you up and start. So there's two sides. There's the player side, who's going to play 1 to 4 heroes. And then there's the controller side, who plays a team of exactly 3 heroes. The controller player is a little bit more complicated just because, you've got to there's a few extra rules with how things activate and how sort of the resources get spent, but not very hard. But a player character, the one who's playing the sort of team of 1 to 4 heroes, I could explain nearly all the rules in about 2 minutes. It's just so easy. The game is set up so that really anyone can just jump right in and get to playing. Yeah, there's a special ability, but your special abilities are fed to you gradually. So you don't have to know everything up front. There might be this scenario-specific rules, like, this time we're trying to get points by killing each other, or we're trying to occupy spots, or, whatever it happens to be. But the rules for Clash are just so snappy and quick. The game is not complex at all. Combat, you roll a certain number of dice, indicated on your board, and there are 3 symbols. One's a hit for up close, one's a hit for ranged, and one's really always a hit and gives you a small bonus as well. Super simple. Archon, though, Fields of Eternia, is so needlessly complicated. On your turn, you have 3 actions. But what are the 3 actions? Well, there's 3 different kinds of movement. There's also moving these other soldiers around. You can move 1 space. You can draw from different decks. At certain points in your turn, you can buy stuff, but you have to do it at the end of your turn, so you really can't use the stuff. Then, you get to combat. It's not roll 4 dice and see what happens. It's first see what kind of combat we're having. Is this soldier combat? Is it heroic epic combat? Or is it combat from sort of this mid-level deck of event cards? And then you sort of have to figure out, okay, so with the epic combat, am I going to use the basic rules, or am I going to use the other rules that allow me to use cards and dice? And then, it doesn't make sense to have that much complication for a game that's supposed to be simple. At its heart, Fields of Eternia is supposed to be a sort of jump in, play through the story, have a good time, fight it out game. But it slogs itself down in needless complexity. And it doesn't come with any kind of player aid. So, you're teaching me the rules, and you're also expecting me to memorize every word that you're saying, or else we're constantly going to have to be looking to the one page in the middle of the rule book that has all the information. It's just needlessly and tediously complicated, and not in a way that adds any value. So complexity definitely goes to the CMON game. Let's talk about rule books for a moment. And here, I won't say that either is a shining star. So Archon's is definitely worse. It's one big rule book with lots of sort of different sections, various stuff all over the place. It doesn't explain about half the rules for solo. It kind of just leaves you to figure them out by yourself. It also has an extra skirmish-based combat where it just says, apply all the normal rules, but with these few changes. But then you have to kind of go back and figure out where those rules are. Setup is just a chore. I mentioned it's easy to set up, but sort of the scenario-based setup portion of the setup is really a chore, because you've got to, like half of the stuff is in one rule book and half of it's in another. the rule book for the Archon game is pretty darn bad. The Simon game, it's okay. Other than the solo, I will say the solo rules definitely could have been a lot clearer. And then a couple of rules about when the team character plays cards could have been a lot clearer. But ultimately, there aren't that many rules, and so you can get a good sense from a quick read of the rules what you have to do, and because of that, the rule book can get away with being a little bit less fulsome, and being a little bit more on the surface. Also, again, it's just such an easy game that you wouldn't expect there to be a lot of rules. Also, on the back of the rule book, there's a nice player aid. It tells you what happens on each turn, what the action choices are, and goes over a couple of things. There's a couple of, I don't know, special conditions. All the special conditions and any special rules are on little cards that you just put out on the table, and everybody can see. Nothing to remember, nothing to memorize. I think there's also a player aid. I don't remember, but just definitely, Clash does a lot better on the rules. Let's go into theme. So I will say, when I opened both boxes, I expected to come out differently than I do. So I looked at the Archon game, and everything looked so thematic. We had, the Horde was coming in, and they had sort of Horde specific missions, and they picked, the right characters from the Horde, the ones you'd expect to see, and there was a nice blurb on their backstory, and the Snake Men were there, and everything was sort of, you know, kind of there and really theme forward. And then the game itself, you're supposed to be playing through this series of events and trying to accomplish this story. But, as I mentioned in my prior review of it, none of that comes through. All of the heroes and all the characters are essentially the same. They just have slightly different stats. Their special abilities can't be used half the time. And when they are, they're minor things like roll a die and you get a bonus to this stat this turn. He-Man is firing magic blasts. That doesn't make any sense. It's just there's so much in there that just feels like it was a game, a half designed game was forced onto this IP, and neither does the other very much or really any favors. On the other hand, Clash I expected to be a schlocky kind of run out and duke it up zombicide style game, honestly. What I got, though, is there's lots of little touches of theme and flavor. All the characters feel very cleverly designed to mimic or enhance or at least emulate the various powers that they would have, those characters would have in the show. He-Man's not firing magic blasts, although he can pick up somebody and throw them. um, all of there's the teams, right? But you sort of see the little thematic touches, like example King Hiss, right? He's famous for sort of having this normal veneer and then shedding that and turning into a five-headed snake. Well, that's what he does, right? One of his special abilities is basically when you get him sort of all the way upgraded, you can essentially trade him in for this five-headed snake character, and that's what he does. Or you have Too Bad, which was two bounty hunters that were sort of combined by Skeletor as a punishment. And all of their abilities are about them arguing with each other. And in fact, ideally, they would be controlled by different players so that they're really getting this fight kind of thing going on. And there's others too. Everything just feels so nicely designed to give you sort of the He-Man experience that you grew up with, if you happen to grow up with it. Also, and this is a dumb thing, but there's a module in the He-Man game, in the Simon game. It's the lesson of the week module. So back in the day, the show felt bad for being a 25-minute toy commercial, and they would put on a little moral at the end. And it was always a dumb thing, like, I don't know, be kind to animals, don't talk to strangers. There was a weird one about the Magna Carta and a weird one about not running around and hitting things with your head. But whatever. Um, there's a little deck you draw from in the Simon game of these little lesson of the weeks, and so you sort of draw one out. And there's a little, dumb moral of the week there. There's even one from Skeletor about how winning's the most important thing. I got a good chuckle out of that. Anyway, there's just so much in this game with simple rules that's sort of designed. It feels like it was designed theme forward, and then they're putting the characters on this simple rule set so that they can all shine. The theme definitely is better in the CMON version. All right, now we're going to go to something that many people won't care about, but I do, and that is solo play. So I've already indicated that the rules for both solos need a little bit of work, but the solo experience is I can definitely judge that. So Archon Fields, the solo experience is a long, complicated series of tasks. As I said in my episode last week, the game is such a slog and is so slow and agonizing. You have a certain number of rounds to complete a number of tasks, but it's like the most random thing whether you're going to be able to do it or not. I mean, you sort of slowly trudge across the board. It's okay. Defeat Shira. Defeat I don't know, some other Buzz Off. I don't remember who it was. Um, but Stratos, if it was Stratos. Um, and then after that, put He-Man on the board in this spot, and he's going to go slowly toward you, beat He-Man, and then fill these areas with soldiers, and then clear out those soldiers. It was so procedural and scripted, but it just was so, it felt procedural and scripted. It just wasn't any fun. There were no wild swings. Also, except in the combat, it's just wild swings. So the combat, remember, in this game is you draw a card, play a card, and you're trying to compete for these three different stats. Well, in solo combat, you draw a card that tells you what your opponent's stats are going to be, and then you might add some extra bonus to them, and then you're going to draw a number of cards from this deck and add those bonuses. It's just randomly wild. It's just like I can't outthink this person. The whole point of that card-based combat was to outthink someone. You can't outthink a bunch of randomness. It's just random. Really a disappointing solo. Also, you can only play some of the missions solo. It's there's just a few that you can do solo, and there aren't really rules for the rest. On the other hand, the CMON game, again, there are only a few missions you can do solo, but there are several of them. And they're kind of the missions that you would normally be playing anyway, like go and kill a bunch of people or occupy certain areas. But the solo, there was so much thought put into the solo. Each and every character comes with its own solo card. So you're going to be playing against the sort of team character if you're playing on solo. And each character has its own independent solo version that is customized with actions that are designed to bring out the same thematic essence of that character, but as part of any solo team. You can put any of the characters on any team solo and have a great experience. The solo rules are pretty simple. A couple of weird points that really need to be clarified in an FAQ, but it's an enjoyable solo experience. Is it best as a solo experience? No, it's definitely better as two players. But as a solo, I didn't mind it. I thought it was a lot of fun, and it was a good way to kind of experience the game. Solo definitely come down hard and strong on the CMON side. Now, artwork. I don't have a lot of thoughts on the artwork. I will say the CMON game is a little more drab looking in terms of the board. The board is just kind of a plain area with a bunch of hexes that you put terrain on. Whereas the Archon game is a little bit brighter. It's got this nice map, an accurate map of Eternia, with lots of locations that you might remember. It is a little bit weird that most of the spaces are too small to put your figure in, but the artwork, I might even come down and say there's more artwork in the base box of the Archon game than there is in the CMON game. But they're probably about the same. Once you add in all of the expansion characters in the CMON version, you end up with a lot there too. It is also, I believe, all original artwork. There are no stills from the show, which is always welcome news. So I'm going to give both of those. I'm going to give a slight nod to Archon, at least as the base box, but they both compete in the same fight there. The next one I'm going to talk about briefly is the minis. So these are both games that are featuring these little figures of the characters from the video or from the toys and the show, and which are better. Well, and here I'm a little bit torn. So I like the CMON minis better. There are more of them, and I think they look better. The Archon minis feel a little bit cheap, a little bit less detailed, but they do have one major advantage. So in Archon, if you're not going to paint your game, the Archon ones are nice because all of the characters are different colored based on their team. So the Snake Men are all green. The Horde are all red, I believe. The Evil Warriors, the Evil Masters of the Universe, are all purple, and then the heroic characters are all white. Although oddly, I think they're blue in the pictures online. Whatever. But so it's easier to tell at a glance which character is yours. Although if you're playing this game, you probably know which character is yours. So I wish the CMON minis were color coded. I think they have better figures overall, better detail, better looking, probably more fun to paint if that's what you're into. But I wish that they were a little bit easier to tell apart because, all of the characters are just kind of gray. I think there might be different shades of gray, but not 50 of them. Anyway, we'll go sort of for the overall feel of the game. And this is very easy to describe. I've already described the Archon game. It is slow. It is agonizingly slow. The CMON game is so fast and snappy. I mean, your turns are like that. You just sort of activate a character. You've already decided which order because you do that sort of as a small programming phase at the end, and there's a little bit of planning and strategy in that. But the turns are the CMON game feels fast and tight. The maps are all very small, so you're going to encounter each other on turn 2 usually. It starts populated with some minions that can go around and sort of give the heroic player something to do, and the villainous player or whatever the controller and the other player. I forget you can use the heroic or sorry the team rules with either one. But it's very fast, very tight, very quick. The game doesn't drag. Every round or two, you're upgrading and getting something new. There's no sort of slow slog across the board only to get sent back home. You do get sent back home if you die, but home's never very far away. So definitely the overall feeling I have for the CMON game is a lot better. The variety. So I mentioned I have sort of both games in full with all their stretch goals and stuff. But there's a lot more in the CMON game. In the Archon game, it came with a couple of, the base box came with who you'd expect. It was Skeletor, Evelyn, Triclops, Beastman, Merman, those sort of standard villains, and He-Man, Teela, Man-at-Arms, I believe Ram Man was in there. Sort of your standard heroic team as well. Plus She-Ra, who doesn't belong there at all. Anyway, unless the Horde's involved. And then, with the expansions, it added the Horde, it added the Snake Men, it added a bunch of other heroes that you care less about. For some reason, everyone's in love with Clamp Champ, whatever, and Hero. The CMON game, however, just has so many more. Base boxes, I think they're comparable in terms of the number of characters, but once you add even one expansion or that amazing stretch goals box, you just have, I don't know, hundreds of characters at that point. They have literally almost everybody except Cyclone and a couple of other sort of minor characters, but anybody you'd want to see is in the CMON game. There's just so much more variety there. The missions are all also very different. You're going to be one mission, there's this dinosaur that's running amok, and you have to sort of beat the dinosaur or avoid getting killed by it. One, you're trying to find somebody and escort them to safety. One, you're trying to just beat each other up and get the most points from that. It's just lots of very, different missions that are all going to feel different. In the Archon game, everything's the same. You might be playing a slightly different story, which will have different events, but ultimately you're going to get points the same way. You're killing opponent players, you're killing these beasts if you happen to randomly draw them in your deck, and maybe if you happen to randomly draw a positive event off the end, plus your sort of 3 gold cards. They all feel the same. It's always the same sort of slow, boring experience. There's just not any variety, even with more characters. All the characters in the Archon version feel exactly the same. There is no variety there. It's do I want a figure that's exactly the same that looks like Evelyn, or do I want a figure that's exactly the same that looks like Shadow Weaver? It just doesn't matter. It's false variety there. And then I'm going to talk about weirdness in the rules. And here, I'm actually going to give it to Archon. Archon, I mean, I've said a lot of things about the rules, but the game is pretty straightforward. Slow and boring, but pretty straightforward. CMON has a weird set of two different kind of asymmetric sides. Now, I like that, but in terms of teaching the game, it's definitely a stumbling block. One player is playing a team of any number of heroes from 1 to 4, and the other is playing a specific team of 3 with sort of a different way of activating special abilities and getting resources. And that sort of disconnect is going to it feels a little bit weird. If you're teaching the game, you pretty much have to play that controller character, just because it's going to be a lot to explain those rules without someone knowing the game. But that said, I do like that the controller character is not, always the villain or always the hero. It's whatever you want it to be. Also, you've just it's a fun, interesting twist, and I think and hope that this sort of power system that they have going on will expand into other IPs, and we can get a compatible version of a Thundercats game, or what was that one that came out? Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, some other sort of IP from CMON. I think it would be an easy crossover. So overall experience, I'm just going to, with the games, CMON's game feels like it was designed by people who loved He-Man. It was designed by people who loved light, kind of raucous, in-your-face, battling head-to-head type games. But they had probably played a lot of games like Zombicide or other kind of games that are dice-heavy in combat, and thought, it'd be great if we could put He-Man on this. And then they got the license and they were like, ooh, now we're going to dive in and we're going to make each character a work of thematic art. Archon feels like they had a game sitting around, sort of a generic fantasy game, and they were like, oh, we can publish this with He-Man characters. Maybe we'll sell more. So we're just going to dump them all into this generic fantasy game. It feels like it was designed first and then had an IP slathered on the top of it. And unfortunately, the game design wasn't all that great. I think that many of the things that the CMON game does, I think it's fair. You have to compare these two games, right? Because they came out within a month of each other with the same theme and, different geographical restrictions. But one is just so very much better. The CMON game, every time I sit down at my table, I'm like, I could pull that out and play it solo. The Archon game, I'm not confident I'm going to play it again. I mean, I probably will, because I always like to give games a chance, but I don't know who it's for. I don't know anyone that I've played with who's had a good experience, including myself. And that doesn't speak very much for the game. So, again, in this sort of Motu smackdown for the crown, the CMON game, Clash for Eternia, it wins hands down. It has the power. Anyway, I was tortured, I know. That's kind of all I've got for you today. I went a little bit long, but, I was talking about 2 games and talking about He-Man, so how could I not? I'll be back again next time on next Wednesday with another episode of Wednesday Whimsy. Not sure what the topic's going to be yet, but I'll figure it out between now and Wednesday. Until then, I'm going to wish you safe travels and courage when you need it, and I hope you'll join me next week for another episode of Wednesday Whimsy, sadly with no He-Man. Anyway, bye-bye.